Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video, and today we're going to talk about being pretty in pink. That's right, it's time to talk about how to paint the color pink. Now this is so bright that it almost doesn't show on camera, like it reflects all funny, but this is Watercolor's Fluorescent Pink, and it will, as you can see, somewhat fluoresce in the light. But we're going to use that as a base, and we're going to talk about the nature of painting pink. As Necromunda's back in season, it's time to get out the punk haircuts. It's time to get out the bright colors and go nuts. But of course, pink is a great color if you're working on something Zinch related, or if you just want a fun, really bright point on the miniature. And that's the first thing to think about when you're going to utilize a color like pink in a miniature. Anytime you've got something as bright as pink, you need to think about balancing it. Never just put pink in like one location. So in this case, in this tutorial, we're going to paint her hair because that's a nice little, it has lots of nice angles and recesses and stuff like that. But keep in mind, as I continue to paint this miniature, this will not be the only place of pink on the mini. If it was, it would be unbelievably distracting and draw your attention basically only to the top of her head and prevent you from moving around the mini. But for the purposes of this tutorial, what's important to understand is that when you do something like paint pink, or say a hyper bright yellow, or something like that, they all have the same properties in that they draw the eye. And so you need to make sure that you're balancing it across the miniature. Okay? So, what have we got as far as paints today? Well, some of the keys to working with pink are that really you want to have one main color of pink you work with. But your shadow colors need to be interesting. So what we've got here in our shadows is a little whole red, which is a very deep, we'll call it a brown red, but it's effectively what it is. And then we've got a little violet game ink. A purple ink is a great shade color to work in lightly to shade your pink. When we talk about highlighting it, increasing the tint, what we want to talk about is flesh tone. I see a lot of people run to white, and a lot of people have problems with pink. I look at people's pink horrors and stuff like that, and I see these really, really hard lines where the paint transitions. And the reason that is because you're going to a brighter color pink that got brighter because it had white in it. So rather than going to a different paint color, I prefer to mix in flesh tone. Flesh tone will still lighten the paint, but is much softer and smoother. It has a higher translucence. In other words, it's less opaque, meaning the lines between layers will be less severe. The more white paint you have to lighten the color, the same thing happens, by the way, with blue and purple. These are the three big offenders. Pink, blue, and purple are traditionally your big offenders for this, in that they add white to get lighter. Well, not this. They add white to get lighter. And as a result, they become very, very streaky and hard to blend. Flesh tone is smoother. It's much less chalky. And it has a higher translucence, meaning that it's much easier to actually create smooth blends. Okay? So, let's talk about how we do this. Well, we're going to start with the very simple step, which is just, I'm going to get some pink on this miniature. Now, this fluorescent pink from Watercolors is part of their fluorescent line. It doesn't actually glow in the dark or anything like that. It's just more about the intensity of the thing. We have a standard zenithal highlight situation here. So, I'm using this relatively thinly. And we're going to just get this on all of her hair. I'm just going to do one side so I don't have to make you watch the whole thing as I base coat. Probably the least interesting thing you could ever watch in a tutorial. But as per usual with Watercolors, it's naturally a very thin paint with this set. I love the fluorescent set. It's incredibly fun, by the way. They have a whole line of these. They have a fluorescent green and yellow and orange, and these are awesome for doing things like hyper bright, sort of energy or engine, like sort of warp gas or engine gas or radiation or anything like that. Anytime you want to get a super bright color going on. Okay, so nothing fancy, nothing magical. We're just spreading it around the mini. Okay? All right. got a little on her forehead there. She has kind of a strange break on her head, so I'm just trying to make sure I can see very carefully where it ends. I love these Necromunda figs, but their hairline is a bit strange in some places due to how their heads get put together, because you can combine different heads with different haircuts. Okay, but who doesn't love a great mohawk, right? Come on. Nothing says style like a mohawk. So, we've got our pink down, no big deal. I want to let that dry completely, because what we're going to do from this point is we're going to do some quick wet blending to get our values in. And when we do wet blending, we always want to make sure that we start by getting a nice middle tone down and letting it dry completely. We don't want to pull up any of that layer of paint. Having a nice solid base color is essential to your wet blending. So if you try to go over your stock zenithal and just start wet blending like crazy, and then you pull paint up or it gets too thin, you reveal the gray underneath. In this case, if that happens, then all that I reveal is the pink underneath, which is what I'm blending out anyways. Sorry, I just noticed a little bit on the tip there that hadn't been covered. Okay. So, that's dry enough now. So now's where we get into our shadow colors, because we're always going to start after our midtone. We're going to go and we're going to create some shadows in the pink. And what we're going to do there is we're going to take a little bit of our whole red, okay, get it over here on our palette. And I'm going to grab a bunch of this pink and just kind of mix it in there. Okay? I'm going to take a tiny dab of that purple ink and get that in there too. Okay? So now what I have is something that looks like that. Almost looks like blood. Like kind of dried blood. Okay? Then I'm going to wipe my brush off. And I'm just going to take this pink on my palette and drag it down into here. So I get a little bit of a blend out between the two. I don't need it to be perfect. I just need to get some range to work with. Wipe my brush again. Then I'm going to take this purple and do the same thing on the other side. Okay. So now what I've got is a couple different areas of paint on my wet palette that look like that. All right. So I'm going to start with sort of my middle dark area here with the purple. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the mini around, and I'm going to find the strands in between the hair, and I'm just going to get this purple down in there. Now, let's talk about ways you could speed this up if you wanted. I like placing these shadows by hand. If you're looking to be a little quicker with this, guess what? You could always just go for the wash. But if you do the wash method, like if you just grab your Druchii Violet and go to town, don't wash all of the hair. Don't ruin this good pink you did by just slathering on some wash. Instead, grab it and wash the bottom here. Like drag your brush along like this. That'll quickly call out all these little areas, okay? Without it like necessarily tinting all the top colors, because I want to preserve that nice bright pink that I've got up above. I don't want to ruin that. All right, and then when I get down here by the bottom of the hair, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually come out onto the strands itself, especially right near the head. Okay, I want to create that to be I want that to be dark. Okay? So, what we get is these nice shadow lines immediately that kind of move us up there. Now, I'm going to go into my sort of whole red pink mixture up here. Give it a little test. Let's get a little more of that in there. There we go. Okay, a little dab of the purple ink. Perfect. There we go. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to trace these lines in the hair the rest of the way up. Create the little shadows in between the areas. And then we're going to go ahead and just kind of pull our other shadows up just a little here near the bottom of the hair. Now, if I wasn't doing this with hair, if I was doing this with, say, her, like, I don't know what you call this, tabard, I would be following the same processes. I would just be pushing the shadows up into the tabard here and then drawing them down, whereas with the highlights, I'd be catching the light points. So the principles are all the same, whether you're doing hair or armor or whatever. And I don't see enough people do pink armor. I think pink armor is sweet, but I say be fearless. Okay, so now let's talk about getting our highlights. What we're going to do is I'm going to get a little of my Moonray Flesh, that very white, light flesh color, but not actually white. And I'm going to grab some of that Fluorescent Pink. I'm going to get that in there, and I am going to get this bubblegum color. You see that? Like, that is pink. Okay. And then with the side of my brush, since this is hair, but you would do it however you wanted to for your surface, I'm just going to go ahead and pick out these high points. Basically, I want to make it thinner or brighter where the hair would naturally thin and more light would get through. Okay. And we get a much easier, smoother blend because we're using a flesh tone to lighten our pink instead of just raw white. We also prevent it from going chalky for that same reason. So it's really a big advantage. Now I'm going to push in a little more of that white. I want a white here that's just like, I basically want just slightly pink tinted white. And then what I'm going to do is very carefully come in here and at the very tips, hit these very tips with a little bit of light. Make sure to focus on the top where the light would be actually hitting it. We're going to trace a few edges up from the darker area. Don't worry, we'll handle that later. Sorry, got out of focus there because I pulled it too close. Okay. But now we have this wonderful, you can see right there. Look how, like, already, I've got to be honest, I'm liking how that's looking, right? Because we've got this wonderful transition up from the lower parts of hair where it's shaded and, you know, nearer to her scalp up to this bright, striking, very violent pink. I know it's a funny word to say, but there we are. Okay, but now we want to kind of smooth it all out because it's pretty stark right now. Before we do that, though, I'm going to grab a little bit sharper brush. I'm going to get into my white again, just have something very near the flesh tone, just like barely pink at all. And what I want to do is I want to grab a few individual hairs. Now, this is a step you wouldn't do probably for, you know, if you were doing anything that wasn't hair. But I want to run it way down and just grab some individual sort of edges or follicles or stuff. Just something to create a little bit of visual interest, because one thing you want to avoid when you're doing hair, and I see a lot of people do this, is you want to avoid the hair being completely horizontally striped. It's dark here, it gets slightly lighter here, it gets super bright here. You want it to be mixed, so you want some of the bright to go down, some of it to come up. Like, you want a general sense that it's moving from darker to lighter, but you don't want that to be the only story. Otherwise, it just feels very, very, very false. Because hair certainly moves toward lighter near the edges. That's definitely true. But here we go. But you know, if you look at hair, hair is incredibly complex. You'll see some dark bits that get up near the top and some light bits that extend way down in. So there we go. Now, okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our original Fluorescent Pink. You could also use some Warcolor's Pink Glaze. This is a nice use for that one if you want. Either one. But we're going to work this. I'll stick with the fluorescent since that's our example here. And I'm going to work that into a nice thin glaze on my palette. I'm just pushing it into the wet palette, making sure it's nice and watered. And then what I get is something like that. You can see how thin that is. Okay? And then what I'm going to do is just very carefully, I've wicked off all the extra. We're not washing. We are painting. And we're just going to touch it all along here. Just do some nice, confident, bold strokes. This is very wet. I wick it over on my paper towel off camera. I test to make sure I don't get too much flow. And then I trace it over the area. I want to paint, not wash with this final step. We are just glazing this all back into alignment. Okay? So then what we get is something that's nicely uniform. We don't have any stark jumps, anything like that. Okay? It brings our darkers, adds a little bit of pink back into the very deepest colors, tones down that sort of flesh tone from being overwhelmingly bright. And we can apply as many as you want. The more glazes you put on, the more you'll bring all the colors back into alignment. Okay? But that's it. You can use the same tricks on the flesh of your, pink horrors, or your Lord of Change, or some demons, or sweet Slanesh, armored troops, or your Necromunda punk haircuts. So there you go. I certainly hope you enjoyed that. That's painting pink. Remember the keys. Start with just one pink. Don't get lots of other pinks in there. Don't create a mess for yourself with different sort of tones when you don't need to, because then you can't control the white content. Start with something that's truly pink. If you don't have something that's truly pink, take a red and mix in your flesh and use that as your base. Use that as your midtone. You want to start with that pink as a good solid base coat, and then I like a nice deep red mixed with a deep purple to create my shade color, which should almost look like, sort of dried purpley blood. That's a great sort of shadow color to pink. For your lighter tones, for your tint and your highlights, you want to use some kind of brighter flesh tone. I like Moonray Flesh from Fantasy Games. It's one of my favorite flesh tones. I use it to highlight purple and blue and everything. It's smoother. You won't run into the chalkiness, and it will blend a lot easier. And then when you're all done, you just want to make sure you get a nice final glaze of that rich pink midtone to bring everything back together into uniform pinkness. So there you go. Her hair is done. I'd probably go in and, repeat this entire process that I just did 2 more times. If something's worth doing once, it's worth doing twice more. So just to make sure her hair really had all the variants in it, because these girls will eventually find their way to a competition table. But I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this was useful to you. I hope it can help you get some sweet punk haircuts on your minis. As always, thank you very much for watching. Give it a like if you did like it. Subscribe for more hobby cheating in the future. Give it a share with somebody if you know they're starting a Necromunda Escher gang. That could be very helpful. Sharing is always the nicest thing you can do and deeply appreciated. But as always, I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.